Okay, welcome back to HI331. This is Module 1, and this is Part 2 of our video lecture. And if you're following along in the slides, you want to look around slide number 52 to pick it up so that you can follow along. Before I continue, though, I wanted to get something out of the way that I intended to mention to you on the last video concerning the expectations for this course. And it has to do with timeliness of submitting exams, discussion boards, any assignment at all. And one thing that I have found is that many times a student will contact me and ask for an extension on an assignment. Sort of, I couldn't upload it in time. The dog ate my homework, kind of a thing. And so I want to just make it clear right now that the standard for this course, according to the syllabus, is that if you do not submit an assignment on time, then you get a 0 for that assignment. There's no exceptions for that. And you may say, well, man, Brother Wells, that sounds pretty harsh. That you're mean, you're being unreasonable and all that. And I'm really not. You have 7 days in which to do a discussion board assignment. That's quite a bit of time to do that. You have really from the start of the course until the end of the course, so that's 7 weeks to complete your battle analysis paper and so forth. So you have ample time to complete the assignment that's given to you. So please manage your time effectively. We're all adults here. There's no reason for you to submit an assignment late. Now, if you know in advance that your whatever electronic device that you utilize, whether it be a MacBook or a Dell or an iPad or an iPhone or whatever it is, if you know it's prone to problems with the internet, then by all means, email me your assignment before you try to upload it to Canvas. That would be my suggestion to you. And if you have to do that for every assignment, I don't care. It's far better than me giving you a 0 because the assignment was late. So if you have a question about that, feel free to text me or email me, and I'll be glad to discuss it further with you. So now, I mentioned this at the end of the last video, but as the war officially began, there were some stark differences that existed between the North and the South. Now, obviously, or not so obviously, depending on how much of a background in Civil War history you have, the North started out the war with a considerable advantage economically. They outnumbered the Confederacy in capacity of trains, weapons, iron capacity, ships, textile mills, etc. Now, there's some reasons for that. For starters, the North had a larger population than the South. They had a population in 1861 at around 21 million, while the South had a population of only 9 million. Now, the North also had access to the Navy, the United States Navy, which was stood up in 1794, a few years after the Revolutionary War ended. And so they had access to an already existing Navy, whereas the South, they really didn't have a Navy until they kind of, refashioned a captured Union frigate and turned it into a steam-powered ironclad. The North also already had an established government, whereas the South virtually had to come up with one overnight when South Carolina and the other 10 states seceded. And then the North, as I mentioned, had more iron, they had more ships, they had more factories which they could produce weapons and weapons of war and so forth. Now, the Civil War would mark the first large-scale post-industrial revolution conflict on American soil, but not the first large-scale post-industrial revolution conflict in history. That would fall there. That honor goes to the Crimean War, which started in 1853 and ended 3 years later. Now, the blueprints for the opposing sides of the Civil War would be virtually identical, since all they knew both sides prior to that, was the Mexican War. And many of the generals on both sides of the Civil War fought together in the Mexican War. So, although a little understood, it's little understood and probably not taught a lot in history classes, the Mexican War actually set the template for how the Civil War would be fought and led. And so At this point, we would stop and watch a brief 3-minute video on the Mexican War, just so you get a little bit of a familiarity with that conflict. Next slide. Similar to the Mexican War, both sides would rely on infantry, just as armies have from time immemorial. Even back in Bible days, there were infantry. Joshua, as he conquered the Promised Land, used infantry, used Israeli soldiers. And so infantry's been around as long as man's been around. Infantry are foot soldiers. They're the grunts, the ground pounders, whatever you want to call them. And so they do the lion's share of the fighting, the hard fighting. They either march to where they have to go, or they're transported via train or truck or aircraft or ship. During the Civil War, they either marched to battle or they were transported via steamship. Being infantry, they would typically be armed with some type of shoulder weapon, a rifle or a musket. They would be expected to live outside. They would live off the land at some point. They would forage for food. They would sleep on the ground. They would sleep in tents or maybe barracks if they were constructed. And so because of this, the infantryman would have to carry his means of sustenance with him on his person in the form of water, rations, and even shelter. So we have infantry. And then we have what's called cavalry. Cavalry. These were horse soldiers, soldiers mounted on horseback, primarily used to scout enemy locations. Like infantry, cavalry has been around since ancient times and was used all the way up until the opening days of World War II, if you can believe that, when Polish cavalry tried to attack German tanks. Not a good idea. Then we have artillery. Artillery has also been around since ancient times, and artillery proved to be really the most destructive element on both sides of the Civil War conflict. Again, artillery is nothing new. The ancient Romans invented the ballistae in the 4th century BC, which fired stones or metal bolts over long distances. The ancient catapult, the trebuchet, these would be examples of artillery. Now, during the Civil War, cannons were the primary artillery weapon of choice. Next slide. The North's ideology was also different than the South's. At first, Lincoln wanted to reunite the fractured Union. To the South, the North had been the invader, was seen as the invader, like, again, comparing to the Revolutionary War, like the British Redcoats. The South hoped to try and evoke cooperation and sympathy from Great Britain, since they were simply trying to defend their way of life from what they perceived as a hostile, tyrannical nation. Next slide. The South framed their ideology around the same ideas that permeated the colonists during the Revolutionary War, and that's one word. That one word is independence. They wanted independence. They wanted independence from an overbearing, tyrannical, Lincoln-led government. Next slide. The opening strategy for the Union derived primarily from their superiority in ships. Next slide. General Winfield Scott, nicknamed Old Fussin' Feathers, conceived a naval blockade called the Anaconda Plan, named after the snake, which was supposed to strangle off, like an anaconda does, or cut off the South to their supplies. This also meant that the South wouldn't be able to export their lucrative cotton crop to Great Britain, to Europe. Now, cotton was king in the South, so that meant cutting off their very livelihood. And the Anaconda Plan involved using Union ships to patrol major rivers, as well as the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, to prevent supplies from reaching the Confederacy. Next slide. So the opening strategy for the Union involved their use of ships, the Anaconda Plan. But the opening strategy for the Confederacy involved fighting a defensive war. Next slide. So that equated to covering or defending 750,000 square miles of territory from an invading Yankee army. Next slide. So they would be forced to move men around from place to place depending on where Union troops threatened. And without a preponderance of railroads at their disposal, this meant that Confederate soldiers would be forced to march, to walk around Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, in the Eastern Theater. So it's no surprise that most Confederate soldiers wore out their footwear and ended up barefoot throughout the war. Next slide. Another notable difference at the outset of the war was in the caliber of generals leading men into battle. This is very important. Our pastor often says, Pastor Chappell often says, that everything rises and falls on leadership. And this is certainly the case in combat, in warfare. Now, except for General Ulysses S. Grant and General William Tecumseh Sherman, most Union generals were political appointees. They got their position because of politics, because they were wealthy, because their daddy knew somebody or something like that. And so as a result of that, they possessed very little in the way of combat experience. Lincoln continued to struggle with his generals for really more than half the war. For the Confederacy, on the other hand, now they were blessed with some truly outstanding tacticians, men like Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Joseph Johnston, and many others. So for what the South lacked in material provision, they more than made up for in generalship. Many historians attribute the superior fighting ability of the South to their Celtic, Scot-Irish makeup of the folks who immigrated to that part of America in the 16 and 1700s. Next slide. In what might be compared to the Battle of Bunker Hill fought on June 17, 1775, the first battle of the Civil War took place, the first major battle, took place in July of 1861 at a place called Manassas Junction in Virginia, also known as the First Battle of Bull Run. Now you might say, well, why has it got two different names? Well, the names of battles in the Civil War were often dependent, or they were differently named depending on which side of the conflict you asked. For example, Union soldiers, far more likely to hail from cities or urbanized areas, are believed to have been impressed with the beautiful geography of the South, including its mountains, its valleys, its abundant rivers and streams, and so in unfamiliar territory, they named many of the battles after those natural features. Hence, Bull Run, the First Battle of Bull Run, was named for a nearby stream called Bull Run. Now, on the other side, for the South, for the Confederacy, troops that would be very familiar with rural, natural terrain, towns and buildings were more memorable to them. And in the South, many of the same battles were referred to after the man-made structures nearby. Hence, the Battle of Manassas, or Manassas Junction, which was a train station. So in all, there's more than a dozen Civil War battles, large and small, that often go by dual names. Now, you're not going to be required to know both names for this course. Some key takeaways to remember, though, about the Battle of Manassas Junction, or the First Battle of Bull Run, are these. First, the main action of the battle centered around a farmhouse called Henry House that sat on top of a hill. Lincoln's first choice to command Union troops, interestingly, had been Robert E. Lee. Remember, I told you earlier that Robert E. Lee was the one that put down or had John Brown arrested for the failed raid at Harper's Ferry. So he was actually part of the U.S. Armed Forces at that time. But Lee chose to side with his native state of Virginia when they seceded, and so he went over to the Confederate side. So General Irving McDowell ended up commanding Union troops at the First Battle of Bull Run. McDowell's plan had been to advance on the Confederate army, commanded by Beauregard, then outflank them, but that didn't happen. The inexperience of McDowell's men showed up almost as soon as they marched from Washington, and what should have taken one day turned into 5 days, by which time the Confederates were ready and waiting for them. Next slide. Another takeaway to remember about this battle is General Thomas Stonewall Jackson earned his famous nickname at this battle. During the battle, Confederate General B.E.E., looked at Stonewall and said to his men, "Hey, look, there's Jackson standing like a stone wall." This is also a battle in which the Union was chased by the Confederates all the way back to Washington, what was called the Great Skedaddle. So when it was all over, when the first Battle of Bull Run was over, both sides realized that they were in for a long, a protracted, and a very, very bloody civil war.